Hollow Tides of the Drowned God. Chapter 8. The Compliance Command Center in the Spire was a temple to silence. Here, 78 years of operational noise, the groaning hull, the weeping pipes, the thrum of turbines that rattled the teeth of the sump dwellers below, was nullified. The air, scrubbed of ozone and brine, tasted of nothing. Polished obsidian floors drank the cold, sterile light from the ceiling panels, and the only sound was the subliminal hum of the city's central nervous system, rendered as a tracery of flowing blue light on a three-dimensional holographic map that dominated the room. Praxilla Varr stood before the map, a severe silhouette against the phantom city. Her uniform was a starched, knife-creased echo of the room's brutalist angles. She did not perceive Amphitrite as a home. She saw it as a system, a complex equation of pressure, power, and population. A system under threat. Her slender fingers moved, not touching the hologram, but manipulating its fields with subtle gestures. The sprawling lattice of the arcology collapsed, zooming with unnerving speed down through the simulated strata of water, past the mirrored dome of the Spire atrium, through the mid-levels, and plunging into the chaotic, pixelated tangle of the sump. Isolate event marker 7 delta, sump sector gamma, sub-level 9, pipe rupture, she commanded. Her voice was as flat and toneless as the recycled air. The hologram shimmered, resolving into a cube of captured data. Inside it, grainy security footage played out in a silent, frantic loop. Water, black and thick, gushed from a massive coolant pipe. Panicked figures, rendered in low-fidelity grayscale, scrambled over each other. The chaos was typical, predictable, an acceptable loss probability event in the city's decaying bowels. But Praxilla was not watching the crowd. She was watching a single data point that had moved against the flow. Isolate subject 482B, she said. Overlay movement trace. A crimson line spooled out behind one of the figures, charting his path. While the others fled from the rupture, a tide of humanity flowing away from danger, this man moved toward it. His path was not random or panicked. It was a straight, clean vector, cutting through the chaos with an unnatural economy of motion. He ignored the primary spray, bypassed the panicked attempts of others to seal the main valve, and went directly to a specific structural joint 20 meters down the line. A joint that, according to every schematic Praxilla had, was perfectly sound. She watched him place his hands on the pipe. The hologram couldn't capture the detail, but the effect was undeniable. He braced himself, and the shriek of metal, logged by audio sensors, changed pitch for a split second before a secondary, smaller rupture occurred right where he was, bleeding off the critical pressure that was about to turn the initial breach into a catastrophic implosion of the entire sector. A fluke, a miracle. Praxilla did not believe in miracles. Analysis, she stated. Cross-reference subject 482B's action with pre-failure structural integrity models. Probability of identifying that specific stress point without prior engineering knowledge. The air filled with a faint digital whir. Text scrolled rapidly at the edge of the holographic display. Robotic. Calculating. Analysis complete. The failure cascade originated from a resonant microfracture not detectable by standard sensors. probability of a non-engineer identifying this precise location preemptively, 0.001%. 0.001, not 0. The system was precise, but for Praxilla, it was the statistical equivalent of an act of God, and God had no place in her equation. Preternatural, she whispered to herself. The word felt unclean in the sterile air. It was a variable she could not account for. She let the footage loop again, watching the red line cut through the gray mob. It was the movement of a predator or a machine, something that knew the shape of the labyrinth while everyone else was just a rat trapped within it. "Access subject's file," she ordered. The frantic scene was replaced by a sterile personnel file. A face, haggard and worn, stared out. The eyes were hollowed by a grief Praxilla recognized as a common workplace hazard in the lower decks. Hull Klinger class.
JORIN, Calais. Assignment, Deep Sea Welder, Class 4. Geothermal Maintenance Division. Residence, Sump, Sector Gamma. Psych Profile. Chronic Trauma Response, Center, secondary to familial loss. Hull breach incident 34 Gamma. Low-level auditory hallucinations reported. Cleared for deep dive duty under continued observation. It was a depressingly common profile. A man haunted by the ghost of a drowned daughter, one of thousands ground down by the city's immense weight. Nothing here suggested an intuitive grasp of resonant hydrodynamics. Nothing explained the anomaly. Cross-reference. Dive logs, last 3 rotations. The file was appended with new data. A list of dates, depths, and durations scrolled past. Praxilla ran a finger along the list, her eyes scanning for another anomaly. She found it. Emergency dive log, TAP 3. Supervisor, Eldrick. Event, catastrophic pressure spike secondary to abyssal tremor tide. Welder, Joran K. Incident, exosuit integrity compromised, hull breach at right shoulder joint. Subject exposed to ambient abyssal environment, sector Gamma 9, for a duration of 1 minute and 42 seconds. Post-incident analysis. Decontamination protocols followed. Medical report notes exposure to high concentrations of unidentified bioluminescent microorganisms. Praxilla froze. Her eyes narrowed, the last flicker of analytical curiosity extinguishing, replaced by the cold, hard vacuum of certainty. The pieces clicked together with the finality of closing an airlock. She gestured, collapsing the dive log and bringing up another file, a classified Sustenance Division report that had crossed her desk that morning. It was flagged with the highest security priority. The report detailed the discovery of a novel microorganism in the primary water reclamation tanks, a microorganism that demonstrated unusual clustering behavior around neural tissues in lab-grown protein samples. Its point of origin, geothermal intake, sector Gamma 9, the same sector as the exosuit breach, the same sector where the city drew its lifeblood and where Joran had been dipped in the abyss. The infection doesn't just kill, she thought. The realization was cold and sharp. It communicates. It transfers knowledge. Joran hadn't been lucky. He hadn't been a hero. He had been a receiver, listening to a signal broadcast from the failing metal of the city itself. The choral echo. It had told him where the pipe would break because it was already part of the pipe. She was no longer looking for a patient. She was looking for a vector, a walking, thinking point of contamination, the first domino in a chain reaction that could collapse amphitrite.
not through pressure, but through biological insurgency. Praxilla's expression was unreadable, a mask of polished control. She turned away from the hologram, her reflection sliding across the obsidian floor. She walked to her central console, the surface a single, seamless sheet of black glass. Her fingers hovered over it for a moment before descending. She pulled up Joran's file one last time. With a series of precise, economical taps, she created a new classification, one that did not exist in the compliance framework until this exact moment. Designation: Patient 0. A glowing crimson flag, like a drop of blood on a black screen, attached itself to Joran's name. It was no longer a personnel file. It was a target. She activated the comms link to her deputy. There was no preamble, no explanation. "Activate Protocol Scylla, Level 1, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Tag Welder Joran, Kale, for immediate retrieval and quarantine." Medium pause. "He is to be considered a Level 4 biohazard. Isolate all his network access. Terminate his jewel-chit accounts. I want him boxed. And I want it done quietly."
The hunger was a parasite of its own, a dull, grinding ache in Joran's belly that gnawed with more immediacy than the ghosts in his head. He clutched the salvaged pressure regulator in his pocket, its cold, dense weight a small anchor in the chaotic tide of the sump's black market. Since Praxilla had slammed the bulkhead shut, this repurposed cargo bay had become the district's desperate heart, a place throbbing with fear and barter. The air was thick enough to chew, a cocktail of ozone from jury-rigged power lines, the damp earth smell of glimmer moss, and the acrid sweat of too many bodies packed into too small a space. Above the din of haggling and arguments, the low groan of Amphitrite's hull was a constant bass-note reminder of the crushing weight of the world. Flickering sodium vapor lamps cast everything in a sickly orange glow, making faces look like fever dream masks. Joran kept his head down, his worn hoodie pulled low. Here, in this maelstrom of paranoia, drawing attention was a death sentence. To be noticed was to be questioned, and to be questioned was to reveal the fractures in his mind. The whispers of the dead were quiet for now, drowned out by the living, but the silence was a coiled snake. Lyra's voice was a constant undertone, the memory of her small hand slipping from his grasp during the breach, replaying like a scratched data drive. Just get food, he told himself, the thought a prayer. One meal, then find a place to hide. His eyes scanned the makeshift stalls. Most offered little more than repackaged nutrient paste or tools of dubious function. But then he saw it. On a stained metal sheet balanced over two crates, a vendor had a small pile of cultivated abyss caps, pale, fleshy fungi that grew near the less volatile vents. They weren't much, but they were real. They tasted of something other than chemical synthesis. They were a luxury he hadn't afforded in years. The vendor was an old man, his face a latticework of wrinkles, his eyes weary beneath a brow permanently furrowed with worry. A classic hull clinger, born and bred in the groaning guts of the city. Joran approached, trying to keep his movements slow, non-threatening. "What do you want for a handful?" Joran's voice was a low rasp, hoarse from disuse. The old man's eyes flicked from Joran's shadowed face to his hands, then back. "What you got?"
Joran pulled the pressure regulator from his pocket. It was a pre-inundation model, solid brass and steel, salvaged from a decommissioned conduit, far superior to the cheap composites the Council issued. Microgauge regulator, calibrated, works. The vendor picked it up, his calloused thumb rubbing over the cold metal. He weighed it in his palm. He seemed to consider it, his gaze distant. It's old. It's reliable, Joran countered. 3 caps. 1, the man grunted, but he didn't put the regulator down. The negotiation had begun. It was a familiar dance, a small slice of normalcy in the madness. Joran felt a sliver of his tension ease. He was just another hungry sump dweller, another face in the desperate crowd. He opened his mouth to argue, to offer too, but his gaze met the vendor's, and the world fell away. It didn't fade. It shattered. The orange light, the smell of ozone, the clamor of the market, they vanished in a blink of impossible blinding white. A high-frequency tone screamed in Joran's ears, scouring his own thoughts from his skull. The feeling of the cold, damp deck beneath his boots was replaced by the sensation of warm, shifting grit between his toes. The briny tang of recycled water was gone, supplanted by an impossibly clean, sharp salt that carried the scent of sun-baked wood and something floral. Not he, the other man, the vendor, was standing on a beach, a real beach. The light wasn't a lamp, it was the sun, a searing golden orb in a vast blue sky that hurt to look at. A gentle wind, a concept so alien it was almost painful, brushed against his skin. He was wearing loose, rough-spun trousers, not the tight synthetic fabric of his jumpsuit. He looked down with eyes that were not his and saw hands that were not his, older, tanned, flecked with age spots, holding a small, intricately carved wooden boat. "It's beautiful, Cale." The voice was music. Joran turned, Cale's head, moving without his command. A woman stood before him, her dark hair whipped by the sea breeze, her smile so radiant it outshone the sun. Her name bloomed in his mind, a flower of pure, unadulterated love. Elena. She took the little boat from his hands, her fingers warm against his. "For our little sailor," she said, her other hand resting on her gently rounded belly. "So he always finds his way home." The joy that flooded him was catastrophic. It was a tsunami of emotion so pure and absolute that it threatened to drown him more completely than any ocean. It was a love for this woman, this life, this unborn child that was utterly, entirely, and devastatingly not his own. It was a memory of a world that was itself a ghost, a time before the great inundation, a moment of perfect, sun-drenched peace, and then it was gone. The whiplash was a physical blow. The brilliant sun collapsed into a single sputtering orange lamp overhead. The infinite blue sky was once again a ceiling of rust-streaked, weeping metal. The warm breeze was a draught of cold, damp air, carrying the stench of decay. Ilana's loving smile was gone, replaced by the vendor's face, his eyes narrowed in suspicion and dawning fear. The joy vanished, leaving a hollow, soul-deep ache in its place. Joran's own grief for Lyra, a familiar stone in his gut, rushed back in, now tangled with the phantom loss of a woman he'd never met. He stumbled backward, tripping over a discarded power conduit. His hand shot out, reaching for the ghost of a face that was no longer there. Ilana? The name left his lips as a broken, confused gasp. It wasn't his to say. It wasn't his memory to mourn. The vendor's eyes went wide with terror. He snatched the pressure regulator from his stall and clutched it to his chest like a ward against evil.
He yanked the metal sheet of fungi back, spilling some of the precious caps onto the grimy floor. "Get away from me!" the old man hissed, his voice trembling. "Rust rot! Get back!" The outburst ripped through the market's hum. Heads turned. The crowd, a moment before a single churning entity, now parted around Joran, creating a sudden sterile circle of space. He was on the floor, propped up on one elbow, the center of 100 hostile stares. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. The words were quiet, but they struck him like stones. Echo touched. Saw it in his eyes, the drowning. He's one of them, a walking ghost. Panic seized Joran's heart, cold and sharp. He had failed. He hadn't just failed to get food, he had marked himself. He was no longer an anonymous shadow. He was a spectacle, a disease made manifest. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his empty stomach. He pushed his way through the crowd, people shrinking from his touch, as if he were superheated metal. He didn't look back. He ran, his footsteps echoing in the narrow, weeping corridors of the sump. The ghost of Callie's joy was a burning coal in his chest, a stark, agonizing reminder of what he had lost and what he was losing. It was no longer just his daughter's voice in his head.
Joran ignored it, his eyes scanning for an exit, a shadow, any place to dissolve back into the anonymous misery of the sump. He saw it, a sliver of deeper darkness between two stacks of repurposed cargo containers, a narrow fissure that promised solitude, a dead-end alley. Perfect. He didn't need to go anywhere. He just needed to be gone. He slipped into the gap, turning his shoulders to fit. The clamor of the market was instantly muffled, replaced by the intimate sounds of the city's decay. A rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water dripping from a corroded pipe onto a sheet of loose steel. The sharp metallic tang of rust was so strong here it felt like he could taste the alley walls. A single sodium vapor work lamp at the far end cast a sickly orange glow, revealing a graffiti-scarred bulkhead slick with black glistening mold. The groan of the arcology's frame settling under the weight of the ocean above was louder here, a deep, resonant ache in his bones. He leaned against the cold, weeping metal, closed his eyes, and took his first real breath in what felt like hours. The breath hitched in his throat. He wasn't alone. Two shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness. They hadn't walked in after him. They had been waiting. They moved with a predatory economy, their presence expanding to fill the narrow space until the walls themselves felt like they were closing in. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. Compliance. It had to be. Praxilla Varr's hounds here to drag him to a quarantine cell for his miracle. He flattened himself further against the wall, muscles coiling ready to fight, to run, to do anything but be taken. But they weren't compliance. The one blocking the alley's entrance was built like a cargo loader, his wide frame encased in a patchwork of scavenged armor. A slab of plating from a maintenance drone was bolted to his chest, and his left arm was a crude, piston-driven prosthetic salvaged from a mining exosuit, its metal fingers thick and blunt. He wore no helmet, just a stained rebreather mask that covered the lower half of his face, his eyes small and flat above it. They were the eyes of a man who dealt in blunt force solutions.
The second figure stood near the dead end, a mirror of the first, but leaner, his form lost in the deeper shadow. He was perfectly still, a predator content to let his partner handle the approach. There were no compliance-issue stun batons, no sterile white armor. This was sump-grown muscle, raw and dangerous. Joran's fear shifted, the sharp terror of arrest curdling into a more primal dread. This wasn't official. This was something worse. The big one took a single, deliberate step forward. The sound of his magnetic boot soles clamping to the grated floor was a deafening clank in the tight space. Joran's own internal static flared. A phantom memory, not his own, flashed behind his eyes. A different alley, rain-slicked concrete from the old world, the glint of a knife. They got me pinned. No way out. The thought was laced with a gangster's cheap bravado and utter despair. Joran pushed it down, his own fear a cleaner, colder thing. Joran. The big man's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, distorted by the rebreather. It wasn't a question. He took another step. The alley shrank. You made a lot of noise back there, fixing that pipe. Joran didn't speak. He kept his eyes locked on the man, his hands held low and slightly open. The whispers in his head were a frantic, overlapping mess. Run. Fight. Trap. 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 The thing is, the man continued, his tone devoid of any emotion, noise attracts attention. Unwanted attention. And we, he gestured with his massive metal thumb, indicating himself and the shadow behind Joran, we don't like unwanted attention. What do you want? Joran's voice was a ragged croak. He hated how weak it sounded. The man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, letting the oppressive silence and the rhythmic drip of water stretch the moment into an eternity. Joran could feel the second man behind him, a cold spot on his neck. He was boxed in, completely. Finally, the first man spoke, the words coming out as flat and heavy as plates of steel. Grendel Brecker wants a word.
The name hit Joran like a physical blow. Grendel Brecker, the Tide Lord, the phantom who ran the Sump's black market, who controlled the flow of salvage, supplements, and secrets. A man spoken of in whispers, a necessary evil who kept the unofficial gears of the lower levels turning. A man who was infinitely more dangerous than a squad of compliance officers because he operated outside their rules. He was the rules down here. Joran's mind raced, connecting the dots, the pipe, the miracle, his sudden inexplicable expertise. It wasn't us compliance who had noticed. Brecker had. And Brecker didn't see a hero. He saw an asset, a tool, a weapon. The fear of capture was gone, replaced by the chilling certainty of being owned. The big enforcer tilted his head. It's an invitation. He let the words hang in the briny air for a second before adding the qualifier, but it's not the kind you refuse. He turned, his broad back a wall of finality, and gestured with his human hand for Joran to walk. The shadow behind him shifted, a subtle sound of scraping metal, closing off any thought of retreat. Best not to keep him waiting, the enforcer rumbled without looking back. Joran's shoulders sagged. The hooks of the crowd's stairs were gone, replaced by a single unbreakable chain. He was caught, not in a net, but in a leash. Pushing off the slick, cold wall, he took a step, then another, following the hulking shape out of the alley and into the lurid glow of the market, a prisoner walking willingly toward his new cage. The two men flanking Joran said nothing. Their silence was a weapon, as heavy and cold as the wrenches hanging from their belts. They guided him through a maze of decommissioned service tunnels, a dead artery of Amphitrite, where the only light came from the sickly green-gold glow of glimmer moss clinging to weeping pipes. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and cold iron. Every drip of condensation echoed like a footstep behind him. A woman's voice, thin and reedy, whispered in his skull, "Not this way. Not for us." Joran ignored them.
He'd been ignoring them for years.
They stopped before a massive circular pressure door, its locking wheel rusted into a single solid piece. One of the men rapped a sequence on the metal, 3 sharp taps, a pause, then 2 more. With a groan of tortured metal and a hiss of displaced air, a section of the door slid sideways, revealing a chasm of darkness beyond. The hum was deeper in here, a bass note that vibrated in Joran's teeth. They pushed him through. He stumbled into a cavernous, spherical chamber. It was a decommissioned primary pumping station, one of the original hearts that once moved water through the city's veins. A titanic, dormant turbine sat in the center like the fossilized skeleton of some abyssal leviathan. The air tasted of ozone and the damp tang of old rust. A single, powerful sodium vapor lamp hung from a jury-rigged cable, casting a stark, sickly orange glare over the chamber's center. And in that pool of light, upon a makeshift throne, sat a man. The throne was an obscene monument to salvaged power. It was constructed from the curved, pockmarked plates of a retired pressure vessel, the metal scarred and dented from decades of withstanding the crushing weight of the ocean. It was a seat built from the city's primary fear, reforged into a symbol of authority. The man on it, Grendel Brecker, matched his throne. He wasn't just large, he was dense, a block of a man carved from pragmatism and muscle. He wore a clean, dark jumpsuit, the fabric utilitarian, but without a single tear. His face was a landscape of old scars and shrewd intelligence, his eyes dark and still as they watched Joran approach. He made a lazy, dismissive gesture with one hand. "Leave us." His voice didn't need to be loud to fill the echoing chamber. It carried a natural, resonant weight. The 2 guards melted back into the shadows without a word, the hidden door hissing shut behind them. The sudden silence was broken only by the hum of the lamp and a rhythmic drip somewhere in the darkness. "Joran." Grendel's voice was smoother now, almost conversational. "The hero of Sector Gamma 9, pipefitter, 2nd class, veteran deep-sea welder. Saved a few hundred souls from a pressure blowout last cycle." Joran's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Apprehension curdled into something colder. "I was doing my job." Grendel let out a short, dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Your job, yes. You knew just where to weld, didn't you? Knew exactly which joint was about to surrender before the strain gauges even went into the red. An intuition like that, it's a rare thing." He leaned forward, the orange light carving deep shadows into his face. The air grew heavy, pressing in on Joran. The Spire-born call it deep-pressure psychosis. The sumprats down in the Whispering Gills, they call it a blessing from the abyss. I call it an asset. The voices in Joran's head stirred. A man's panicked gasp, a child's sob, the sound of water rushing into a confined space. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, fighting to keep his own thoughts separate from the invading tide. "I don't know what you're talking about," Joran said, his voice strained. Grendel's smile was devoid of warmth. "Don't you? The whispers that aren't yours, the faces in the dark, the sudden gut-deep certainty. Ah, that's not sickness, Joran. It's attunement. You're echo-touched." The term hit Joran like a physical blow.
It was sumprat slang, a word whispered in the darkest corners about those who went mad from the pressure, who heard voices. But Grendel said it like a diagnosis, a title. Amphitrite is a living thing, Grendel continued, his voice dropping, becoming hypnotic. It's a body, and it's failing. The hull is the whole. Rust rot. The hull is a cage, and the cage is groaning. It's screaming. But only a few people are quiet enough to hear it. You can hear it. You have a direct line to the city's soul. The phrase hung in the air, monstrous and compelling. The city's soul. Joran thought of the cacophony in his mind, the chorus of drowning victims, the endless loop of terror and final breaths. He thought of his daughter's voice, the one clear note in the storm, now getting harder and harder to find. "It's a parasite," Joran said, the words tasting like poison. "It's killing me."
Killing you? Grendel stood up, his sheer size commanding the space. He walked down the 2 steps from his throne, his boots crunching on loose grit. Is a radio killing the man who listens to it? Is a new set of eyes a disease? No, it's information. The choral echo doesn't just archive people, Welder. It archives the city itself. Every stress fracture, every failing rivet, every microscopic fissure. Its victims saw them, felt them in their final moments, and now you see them too. He stopped just a few feet from Joran. The ozone smell was stronger, coming off him like an aura. Praxilla Varr and her compliance hounds, they see a contagion to be sterilized, a bug to be squashed. They want to cut you out, burn you clean. They see a disease. Grendel leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. I see a tool. The most powerful tool in this entire drowned world. Imagine knowing where the next bulkhead will fail, where a power conduit will rupture, where a rival crew has stashed their salvage. That's not a sickness, Joran. That's leverage. That's power. Joran stared at him, his mind reeling. For years he had seen his condition as a curse, a private haunting that was slowly erasing him. He was a ghost, haunted by other ghosts. But Grendel was offering a different interpretation. Not a cure, not absolution. A purpose. What do you want? Joran asked, his voice barely audible over the thrum of the station. Grendel's smile returned, wider this time. It was the smile of a predator that had just cornered its prey only to offer it a partnership. I don't want to cure you, Joran. I want to hire you. The city is whispering its secrets. I just want you to tell me what it's saying. The voices in Joran's head were quiet. Unnaturally quiet, as if they too were listening, shocked into silence by the sheer, terrifying audacity of the proposition. For the first time since the accident, the screaming had stopped, and in its place, a single, horrifying thought bloomed in the silence. The idea that his curse could be controlled, that it could be used, and that, perhaps, was the most frightening thing of all. The air in Grendel Brecker's pumping station was thick enough to drink. It tasted of ozone from an arcing conduit box and the sharp, briny tang of unfiltered bilge.
3 massive recycler pumps dominated the cavernous space, each one shuddering with a deep rhythmic thrum that vibrated up through the soles of Joran's worn boots and into his teeth. The sound was a physical presence, a constant, grinding beat that almost, but not quite, drowned out the other noises, the ones inside his head. Water in the lungs. Cold, so cold. Joran flinched, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. The memory wasn't his. A maintenance tech, 3rd class, fell from a catwalk into a reclamation basin. He could feel the shock of the icy water, the futile grasping of hands on slick metal. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the ghost. Grendel watched him from across the grated floor. The Tidal Lord was perched on a stack of salvaged power cells, polishing the lens of a pre-inundation monocular with a stained rag. He wasn't a large man, but he filled the space with a predator's stillness. His face was all sharp angles and shadows under the sickly orange glow of a single sodium lamp, his eyes dark and appraising. He hadn't said a word since his men had cornered Joran in the Whispering Gills and brought him here, not with threats, but with a quiet, undeniable finality. "You look like rust rot, Joran," Grendel said, finally, his voice a low gravel that cut through the machinery's hum. He set the monocular aside. "But you're alive. Which is more than I can say for anyone else Praxilla Varr puts on her list." Joran lowered his hands. His gaze darted to the only exit, a heavy pressure-sealed door currently dogged shut. He was trapped. The shock of his capture had curdled into a cold, heavy dread in his gut. "What do you want, Grendel?" Grendel let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Direct. I like that. Saves on energy." He stood, stretching like a cat, and walked toward a makeshift table cluttered with schematics and dirty mugs. He poured a dark liquid from a metal flask into one of the mugs and pushed it across the table toward Joran. "Here, real grain brew, not that synth CAF sludge they serve topside."
The aroma hit Joran first. Bitter, earthy, real. It was a scent from a life he'd almost forgotten. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten anything but a stolen nutrient bar in 2 days. But he didn't move. Nothing from a Tide Lord came without a price. "I'm not thirsty," he lied. "No, you're not," Grendel agreed, taking a sip from his own mug. "You're hunted. You're scared. And you're changing. I can help with the first 2. The third is where you can help me." A high-pitched shriek of stressed metal echoed from somewhere deep within the arcology's bones. It was a sound Joran had been hearing for weeks, but this one was sharper, more immediate. He winced, his eyes instinctively looking up and to the left, as if he could see the strain through meters of bulkhead and piping. He felt it, a support on deck Gamma 7 near the primary aquacultures groaning under a pressure load it wasn't designed for. Grendel's eyes tracked his movement. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "There, you see? That's what I'm talking about." Joran's blood went cold. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Grendel took a step closer, his voice dropping. "Praxilla thinks you're patient 0, a disease to be cut out. She's broadcasting your face on every public terminal, offering jewel chits and extra rations for any word on your whereabouts. She thinks you're a plague. I think you're an asset." The word hung in the damp air, oily and obscene. An asset. The thing that was eating him from the inside out, the chorus of drowning voices that was erasing his daughter's face, was an asset. "I'm a welder," Joran said, his voice tight.
You were a welder, Grendel countered smoothly. You're something else now. I was there when that pressure conduit blew in the market. Saw it on the security feeds. Everyone running. Chaos. Water everywhere. And you. You walked right to junction 34 kilo. Cool as you please. You didn't check schematics. You didn't guess. You knew. You knew that was the valve that would hold. You saved hundreds of lives and signed your own death warrant in the process.
He let that sink in, then gestured around the humming station. I offer sanctuary, Joran. A place to lie low, where compliance goons won't look twice. Food that doesn't taste like recycled algae. Protection. My people control the guts of this city. We know the ways in and the ways out. As long as you're with me, Praxilla's leash is too short to reach you. The offer was a lifeline, thrown into the abyss Joran was drowning in. He could almost feel the phantom pressure of the noose loosening around his neck. The exhaustion of the past few days washed over him, a bone-deep weariness that made him want to collapse. But he held himself rigid. In exchange for what? Grendel's smile returned, wider this time. It held no warmth. My business, Joran, is finding the cracks, the vulnerabilities. A security patrol route with a blind spot. A cargo manifest with a mislabeled container of Spire-borne luxuries. A power conduit that can be tapped without tripping the grid monitors. He paced slowly, his boots clanging on the metal grate. Amphitrite dying, we both know it. The hull is the hull, they say, deep and safe. Rust rot. The hull is rotting from the foundations up, and in a rotting structure, knowing exactly where the decay is, that's power. He stopped directly in front of Joran. The thrum of the pumps seemed to fall away, leaving only the low, oppressive hum of the station and the sound of his own ragged breathing. You hear the walls groaning, welder, Grendel said, his voice a low, intense whisper. You feel the city's pain. Joran stared at him, the raw, transactional horror of the bargain laid bare. Grendel wanted to weaponize his sickness. He wanted to use the voices of the dead, the echoes of 1,000 last moments, to line his own pockets. He wanted Joran to be his divining rod for profit, pointing out the weak points in the dying city so Grendel could pick at the wounds. He's using you, just like the water. It uses you, fills you up until there's no room left. The voice was a woman's this time, a Spire-born who'd opened a vent in despair. Her memory was one of sterile silence and the cold bite of the void. To be hunted alone was to die. To be caught by Praxilla was to be dissected, unmade on a sterile slab. But to accept this, to become a tool for this man, it was a different kind of death, a surrender, an admission that the man named Joran was already gone, replaced by something useful, something to be exploited. And yet, sanctuary. Food, a moment to breathe, a chance to understand what was happening to him without looking over a shoulder every second. The wary consideration began to crystallize in his mind, a cold, hard shard of pragmatism. He was already a ghost, haunted and haunting. What difference did it make if his haunting served a purpose? He finally looked at the mug of real grain brew Grendel had offered. It was still steaming gently in the cold air. A small, solid piece of a life he thought he had lost forever. His own voice was hoarse when he spoke, barely a whisper against the thrum of the pumps. How do you know that I can control it? The pumping station thrummed, a constant deep-frequency vibration that Joran felt in his teeth. It was the sound of a failing heart trying to push sluggish blood through sclerotic veins. Oily water dripped from the ceiling joists.
each drop a percussive beat in the groaning symphony of the sump. The air, thick with the tang of rust and the sharp bite of ozone, was sliced by the harsh orange glare of a single sodium vapor lamp, making shadows writhe like things caught in amber. "I'm done with this fungus-addled chatter," Grendel's voice boomed, echoing off the corroded metal walls. The Tidal Lord stood with his arms crossed, a mountain of muscle and salvaged plating, his face a mask of brutal impatience. His 2 men, Bruce and Cale, had Hestian by the arms, their knuckles white. The Sumprat mystic looked impossibly small between them, his thin frame draped in rags that were surprisingly clean. He offered no resistance, his expression one of unnerving calm. "Let him go," Yoren said, the words feeling scraped from his throat. The cacophony in his head, the whispers of the drowned, had receded to a low murmur in Hestian's presence, like a tide pulling away from the shore. He didn't understand it, but he was desperate to hold on to the quiet.
Grendel shot him a look of pure disbelief. "Let him go! Joran, are you precious sick? This thing is a symptom, not a solution. He talks about harmony with the rust-rotted ghost in the water, while our people are about to be welded into this coffin. We need action. We need a breach. We need a weapon." He jabbed a thick finger in Joran's direction. "That's you, not him." "The chorus isn't a ghost," Hestian said. His voice was soft, yet it cut through the din of the machinery with impossible clarity. "It's a memory. It doesn't want to hurt us. It only wants to remember." Bruce shoved him forward. "Shut your gills, rat!" Hestian stumbled, but didn't fall, his bare feet making no sound on the grated metal floor. He looked directly at Joran, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out gray, seemed to see past the haggard exterior, past the exhaustion, and into the screaming chaos behind his ribs. Joran felt a sudden vertiginous flash, not his own memory, but someone else's. Cool water, a woman's hand, the scent of salt and sunlight on her hair. The image was gone as quickly as it came, leaving a phantom ache of loss. It was one of theirs, one of Hestian's followers. He was feeling what they felt. "You see," Hestian's lips barely moved. "You are a part of it now, a strong voice in the song. But his path," he nodded towards Grendel, "his path is a scream. It will bring only dissonance. It will bring pain." Grendel laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Pain is a tool, old man. Fear is a motivator. I'm going to use that fear to hammer a hole in Praxilla's perfect little world. And you," he jabbed his finger at Joran again, "are going to show me where to strike. We've been over this. Find me the weakest point, a stress fracture, a corroded seal, a place they won't expect." Joran's hands clenched. Grendel's plan was simple, brutal, and suicidal. A mob of desperate, terrified sump-dwellers thrown against the main quarantine bulkhead as a diversion. Cannon fodder. While they were being gunned down or crushed, Grendel's crew would cut through a maintenance hatch that Joran would identify. It was a trade, hundreds of lives for a dozen. It was a Tide Lord's calculus. "I won't," Joran stated, the words tasting like metal shavings. "I won't send them to die for you."
"You will," Grendel said, his voice dropping to a low growl, "because the alternative is sitting here and waiting for the water to turn to poison and the air to run out. The alternative is letting Praxilla's butchers come down here and carve you up like they will him. Now get him out of my sight." As Bruce and Cale started to drag him towards the heavy-pressure door, Hestian twisted his body, a surprisingly fluid movement. He wasn't fighting them, but maneuvering.
His free hand, thin and calloused, darted out and grabbed Yoren's wrist. His skin was dry and strangely warm. It wasn't the clammy, perpetual dampness of the sump. For a second, the babble in Yoren's head went utterly silent. The silence was a physical blow, more shocking than any sound. All he could hear was the thrum of the pump and his own ragged breathing. "Do not let his fear become your tide," Hestian breathed, his eyes locked on Yoren's. He pressed something small, hard, and cool into Yoren's palm. "Listen, not with your ears, with the chorus." Yoren looked down. Curled in his hand was a small, intricately carved piece of bone-white coral, no bigger than his thumb. It was shaped like a spiral, and deep within its form, a soft, greenish-gold light pulsed in a slow, gentle rhythm. It felt organic, alive, the same ghostly bioluminescence that clung to the wet bulkheads, but concentrated, focused. "It's a seed," Hestian whispered, his voice urgent as Kael tightened his grip. "It's a seed of silence. It will glow brightest where the chorus is calmest, where the memories are at peace." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of damp earth and moss. The old filtration warrens, under the decommissioned algae vats, sector GAMMA7. The water runs deep there, but it is quiet. It is a place to listen, to understand. "Enough!" Grendel stormed over, shoving Hestian away from Yoren. "Get this crazy old rust-rot out of here, now!" The two thugs didn't need a second command. They hauled Hestian towards the exit, his feet dragging on the grating. The sump rat didn't struggle. Just before the door slammed shut, he looked back over his shoulder, his eyes finding Yoren's one last time. There was no fear in them, only a deep, sorrowful pity. Then the heavy steel door crashed home, the sound of the locking bolts, like a final judgment.
The echo of the slam faded, replaced once again by the oppressive thrum of the station. The voices in Joran's head rushed back in, a tidal wave of confused whispers and panicked gasps. Lyra's laughter, a fisherman's dying prayer, a technician's curse as a pipe gave way. The brief, beautiful silence was gone. Grendel was breathing heavily, his face flushed with anger. Sump rats and their riddles. Peace. Ha! There's no peace at the bottom of the ocean, Joran. There is only pressure, and the choice of what breaks first, you or the hull. He paced for a moment, then stopped, his expression hardening. Forget him. We act at the next shift bell. You will give me a location, or I will find someone who is just as echo-touched as you, but far more cooperative. The threat was clear. Joran was a tool, but a replaceable one. Grendel turned and stalked up a flight of metal stairs to his makeshift office, leaving Joran alone on the main floor. Joran didn't move. He stood under the sickly orange light, the damp air cold on his skin. He uncurled his fingers. The coral seed lay in his palm, its internal light pulsing softly, a tiny living heart of green-gold fire. It was faintly warm to the touch. He watched as its glow seemed to dim slightly, then brighten, pulsing in an unsteady rhythm, as if reacting to the frantic storm of echoes in his own mind. A seed of silence, a place to listen. He had a choice. Grendel's path of blood and iron, or a cryptic whisper leading into the darkest, most forgotten depths of the city. A leap of faith. He closed his fist around the coral, its strange warmth a stark contrast to the cold dread coiling in his gut. The massive, rust-wept gears of the pumping station ground to a halt. In the sudden ringing silence,
Only the hiss of leaky hydraulics and the sharp, clean scent of ozone remained. For a moment, Joran thought the power had failed again. Then he saw the figure standing in the arched entrance, haloed by the sickly orange glow of the corridor beyond. It was Hestian. He wasn't armed. He wasn't flanked by his Sumprat followers. He stood alone, his thin frame draped in scavenged, water-stained fabrics. His bare arms and the high bones of his cheeks were traced with faint, shifting patterns of green-gold bioluminescence, like living circuitry. He looked less like a man and more like a piece of the deep abyss that had somehow wandered into the sump.
Surprise was a luxury. In Grendel's world, it was instantly replaced by threat assessment. Two of the Tide Lord's crew, men with faces like bruised knuckles and cybernetics bolted crudely to their skulls, reacted instantly. The click-clack of safeties being disengaged on heavy-gauge rivet guns was deafening in the quiet. They leveled the weapons, their barrels pitted with rust, but undeniably lethal, at Hestian's chest. Hestian did not flinch. He didn't raise his hands. He simply blinked, his gaze slow and patient, and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a known formality. Inside Joran's head, a new voice, a whisper like sand scouring metal, surfaced. He sees the line of the shot. He knows the failure point in the trigger mechanism. He does not fear it. Joran's own hand twitched, his muscles clenching with a phantom memory of a welder's grip. Grendel Brecker moved into the space between his men, a hulking silhouette against the flickering work lamps. He was a creature of iron and noise, and the silence seemed to offend him personally. He let out a short, barking laugh that echoed off the curved steel walls. Rust rot. Look what the tide dragged in. The whisper peddler himself. Grendel spat a thick glob of something dark onto the grated floor. You got a lot of nerves, Sumprat, coming into my house. This isn't a house, Grendel. Hestian's voice was unnervingly calm, a still pool in the station's torrent of hostile energy. It carried over the hum of the backup capacitors without effort. It's a cage. You've just bolted a bigger engine to the bars. Grendel's smile was a slash of predatory intent. He gestured expansively with a thick-fingered hand, his other resting near a plasma pistol holstered at his hip. This cage runs. This cage has teeth. He jabbed a thumb towards the massive, humming converter at the heart of the station, its coils glowing with stolen power. What I have is control, something your echo-touched followers seem to have forgotten the meaning of. They just float and listen, waiting for the abyss to swallow them whole.
He took a step closer to Hestian, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial growl meant for everyone to hear. This echo, it's a power source, you pale-skinned fool. It's a current, and a current can be channeled. It can be aimed. He turned his head just enough to pin Joran with a significant look. It can be a weapon, something to break down the Spire's doors. But you want to, what, pray to it? Hestian's expression didn't change, but his luminous markings pulsed a little brighter, their light catching the perpetual condensation on the walls. You see a current to be damned, Hestian said, his eyes leaving Grendel to meet Joran's. The connection was immediate, a jolt of recognition that went deeper than sight. The cacophony in Joran's mind quieted for a heartbeat, replaced by a single, resonant hum. I see a tide that's coming in. You can't dam a tide. You can't weaponize an ocean. You can only learn its rhythms, or you can drown. What a load of rust rot! Grendel snapped, the facade of amusement cracking. His voice rose, bouncing off the iron. The hull is the whole. That's the only truth down here. We survive because we force the world to bend. We weld, we drill, we build walls and pump out the dark. We don't invite it in for a chat. The hull is already breached, Hestian countered, his calm unwavering. Not with water, Grendel, with memory. It's in our pipes, it's in our air. Soon it will be in everyone. Your walls are meaningless. You're trying to hold back a ghost with a rivet gun. Joran felt a cold dread mix with a strange sense of vindication. Hestian was putting words to the terror that had been liquefying his own identity for weeks. The memories weren't just in him, they were everywhere. A memory fragment bloomed behind his eyes, not his own. A young woman, her face streaked with grime, tasting unfiltered water for the first time. A stolen luxury. The metallic tang, the hint of mineral life, was so real he could almost taste it himself. He swallowed, his throat dry. Grendel's face was a mask of thunderous rage. He was a man who solved problems by hitting them, and Hestian was a problem he couldn't find a surface to strike.
"So what's your solution then, prophet?" Grendel sneered. "We all just lie down, let this thing turn us into glowing slack-jawed ornaments for the sump? Let it eat our minds until we forget our own names?" That hit Joran like a physical blow. To forget his daughter's name. To have her face dissolve into the crowd of ghosts in his head. That was the core of his fear. He looked at Grendel, at the raw, violent certainty on his face, and felt a pull towards that brutal simplicity. Control, fight, resist. "Forgetting is not the same as letting go," Hestian said softly. "The echo doesn't eat. It archives. It remembers everything, every life, every loss. It's a library of the drowned. To fight it is to fight the memory of everyone who ever died in this abyss." He took a single soft step forward, and the two guards tensed again. To accept it is to understand you are not just one voice. You are the chorus. The air thickened, heavy with the weight of their opposing truths. The hum of the machinery seemed to recede, leaving only the three of them in a pocket of profound, terrible silence. Grendel, with his furious desire to seize this new power and forge it into a sword. Hestian, with his serene plea to dissolve into a greater collective consciousness and find peace. And Joran, standing between them. He looked from Grendel's clenched fists and the promise of a war he could fight, to Hestian's glowing skin and the promise of a peace that might cost him his soul. He was a fulcrum, a balancing point for two impossible futures. His gaze fell on his own hands, the welder's calluses, the faint tremor he could never quite stop. These hands were made to join things together, to seal fractures under pressure. But how could he possibly weld these two worlds? How could he choose? He was standing between a man who saw a weapon and a man who saw a god. And in the depths of his own fracturing mind, Joran was beginning to suspect they were both right.
The echoes of Grendel's propositions still hung in the air, greasy and thick as the sump oil slicking the floor. Joran had found a corner in the Tide Lord's cavernous hideout, a nook between a stack of inert data drives and a wall sweating black condensation. He was supposed to be considering the offer. Pinpoint a weakness in the bulkhead for Grendel's rebellion. trade 100 anonymous lives for a chance. A chance at what? Escape? There was no escape. Not from Amphitrite. Not from the choir of the drowned in his head. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, trying to force the pressure inward, to physically crush the phantom sounds. The hideout smelled of ozone from a jury-rigged power conduit and the earthy, sweet rot of glimmer moss farmed in a nearby trough. Beneath it all was the constant, low thrum of the arcology, the deep-frequency groan that was the city's only lullaby, deep and safe. Rust rot. He just wanted a moment of silence, one goddamn moment. It started not with a voice, but with a taste, a sudden sharp spike of salt on his tongue, so real he gagged. It wasn't the recycled, flat taste of the city's water. This was wild, ancient ocean. Cold, vicious. His own breath hitched, and the air filling his lungs felt heavy, waterlogged. The low thrum of the turbines faded, replaced by a high metallic shriek, a sound he knew intimately, the sound of a hull giving up. He wasn't in Grendel's hideout anymore. The floor beneath him was canted at a sickening angle. He was standing in knee-deep, freezing water, the orange glow of a single emergency lamp casting spidery shadows that writhed with the sloshing tide. Wires thick as his arm dangled from the ceiling, spitting blue sparks where they touched the rising water. The smell of ozone was a lightning strike in his nostrils. He was in a maintenance corridor. Section Gamma 7, maybe? No, the markings were wrong. Older. First-generation stenciling. This wasn't his memory. Panic, raw and undiluted, seized him. It wasn't his panic. It belonged to the body he now inhabited. The man's, his, heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. A name surfaced from the cold, a piece of flotsam in the mental tide. Kalen. His name was Kalen. He was a systems tech. Third shift. No. 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 The voice was a ragged whisper, torn from a throat tight with terror. Joran felt Kalen's lips move, but the thought was his own. Get out. This isn't yours.
But the choral echo held him fast. Kalen's muscles bunched, and he surged through the water, his borrowed legs heavy, clumsy. He had to get to the Junction 4 pressure door. He had to get to it now. The shrieking of stressed metal grew louder, a chorus of tearing steel that vibrated through the water and up his bones. Joran felt a phantom agony in his shins from the cold, the beginnings of a deep, creeping numbness. A memory flared behind Kalen's eyes, a memory Joran saw with perfect clarity. A small girl with a bright yellow ribbon in her tangled brown hair, laughing as she hid behind this very door during a game of hide-and-seek just a cycle ago. The memory was so sweet it was poison. "Marta!" Kalen screamed, and the name was a shard of glass in Joran's mind. He slammed his body against the pressure door. It didn't budge. A red light flashed above it. Lockdown engaged, equalization failure. He clawed at the manual release wheel, his fingers numb and slipping on the cold steel. The water was at his waist now, its icy grip relentless. Through the door's small, reinforced porthole, a face was looking out. A small, pale face, framed by dark, floating hair. The girl, Marta. Her little hands were pressed flat against the thick polymer glass, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her father's. She wasn't crying. The sheer shock was too great. Just like the Laura. The thought was Joran's, a sliver of his own grief piercing through the suffocating curtain of Kalen's horror. She wasn't crying either. She just watched me. Kalen beat his fists against the door, a frantic, useless rhythm against the symphony of the dying compartment. "I'm here! Marta, I'm here! Daddy's here!" The water was at his chest, so cold. It felt like his blood was turning to slush. Joran could feel Kalen's lungs beginning to burn, the desperate primal urge to gasp for air that was no longer there. He was drowning. They were drowning. Again. He looked through the porthole one last time, his vision blurring as the icy water lapped at his chin. He had to see her face. He had to burn the image of her into his soul before the abyss took him. Her brown eyes, wide and dark, the small mole just above her lip, her tangled hair floating like a dark halo. And then it happened. The image flickered, a data glitch in his soul. For a terrifying, impossible second, the girl's face changed. Her tangled brown hair became a sheet of smooth, impossible blonde. Her dark eyes flashed to a piercing crystalline blue. Her dark eyes flashed to a piercing crystalline blue. Ilara's blue. The shape of her mouth, crying a name that was not his, was suddenly Ilara's mouth, forming the word Papa that the water had stolen from him years ago. The mole vanished. The face in the porthole was his daughter's. Kalen's grief and Joran's guilt collided. They fused. The two moments, years and lives apart, became one single unbearable point of agony. He was losing his daughter all over again, but through another man's eyes. Whose loss was this? Whose child was drowning? "Ilara!" The scream was a monstrous hybrid thing, half his, half Kalen's. It was the sound of a spirit being torn in two. The force of it threw him backward, out of the memory, out of the cold, out of the water. He landed hard on the solid, grimy floor of Grendel's hideout. The impact rattled his teeth. He gasped, sucking in the thick, metallic air, his lungs aching as if he'd truly been deprived of oxygen. He was on his hands and knees, shaking uncontrollably. The low thrum of Amphitrite returned, a mocking, steady heartbeat. The smell of ozone and rust filled his senses. He was back, he was safe, but he wasn't. He stared at his hands, splayed on the dirty floor plating. They were his hands, scarred, calloused, a welder's hands, not Kalen's. But the memory of the cold, the memory of the futile struggle against the wheel was branded into their flesh. And the face, his daughter's face, superimposed on another's. The memory wasn't his anymore. It was corrupted, contaminated. The choral echo hadn't just made him witness another's pain, it had stolen his own. It had taken the most sacred, most horrible moment of his life and twisted it into something unrecognizable. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. My daughter's face. Was it my daughter's face? He couldn't be sure. For that one terrible second, he truly could not be sure. The foundation of his entire broken identity, the grief for Ilara, had cracked. A low, wretched sob escaped his throat. It wasn't a sound of sadness, it was a sound of pure, undiluted horror. The ghost he had carried for years was no longer his own.
The memory wasn't an echo. It was a parasite wearing her face. Joran sat hunched on a rusted crate in the darkest corner of Grendel Brecker's scavenged domain, a forgotten maintenance nexus where the city's metallic groans were muffled by stolen power and illicit ambition. The air was thick with the tang of ozone and the faint, sweet decay of glimmer moss.
His hands trembled, not from the sump's perpetual chill, but from the aftershock of a psychic theft. He had reached for her, for the one clean, sharp shard of pain he had left, the memory of Maya, her small hand slipping from his grasp in the swirling chaos of the breach. The water, so black, so absolute. It was his anchor, his penance. But this time, this last time when he'd looked at her face, her eyes wide with fear, they had flickered. For a gut-wrenching second, they were not her eyes. They belonged to a boy he'd never met, his face pale and his lips blue, drowning in a different catastrophe, a different lifetime. The choral echo hadn't just added a new voice to the choir, it had invaded the sanctuary. It had put on a mask of his daughter and defiled his grief. He pulled a small object from the pocket of his coveralls, Hestian's gift, a fragment of biomineralized coral, no larger than his thumb. It pulsed with a soft internal light, a steady green gold that mirrored the phosphorescent fungi clinging to the bulkheads. Hestian's voice, calm and detached, played in his mind. The echo doesn't take, it archives. The tide does not hate the stone it smooths. You must stop fighting the current. Joran stared into the coral's serene glow, trying to find that peace, trying to feel the truth in Hestian's words. He held it up, the light making a small, holy circle on his grime-stained palm. Let go. Accept. Become part of the archive. A single drop in a vast, silent ocean of shared experience. For a moment, the idea was seductive. An end to the struggle. An end to the specific, cutting pain of Maya's memory. If he let it all wash away, perhaps there would be silence. True silence. Then the image returned. The boy's face superimposed on his daughter's, a grotesque composite, a collage of death. And the lie of Hestian's philosophy laid itself bare. This wasn't smoothing a stone, it was pulverizing it into anonymous dust. This wasn't archiving, it was erasure. The quiet hum of the choral wasn't peace, it was the sound of dissolution. A sick, cosmic joke, where the punchline was his own annihilation. His grief for Maya, the last thing that was truly his, would be rendered just another piece of data. Catalogued, filed away, meaningless. His knuckles went white. The coral in his hand suddenly felt alien, cold, a tool of surrender. Then came another voice, this one rougher, edged with cynical pragmatism. Grendel. He could see the Tide Lord's scarred face lit by the flicker of a plasma torch. This thing in your head, Joran, it sees the city's bones. It knows every crack, every weakness. Stop trying to pray it away. It's a weapon, a key. Point it at something. Use it before it uses up all of you. Control. The word was a stark, brutal contrast to Hestian's gentle acceptance. Grendel wasn't a mystic. He was a predator. He saw the echo not as a spiritual tide, but as a resource to be exploited, an advantage in a world with no advantages left. The idea had repulsed Joran. To weaponize the voices of the dead, To turn their final terrifying moments into a tool for black market profit? It felt monstrous. But what was the alternative? To sit here and let his soul be eaten piece by piece? To let the memory of his own daughter be corrupted and overwritten until he couldn't even remember the color of her eyes? The horror of that thought was a physical force, a pressure in his chest worse than the abyssal deep. That specific pain, that singular grief, it was the last pillar holding up the man named Jarin. Without it, he was just a shell, a host, another sump rat listening to whispers in the gills. He looked from the glowing coral in his hand back into the oppressive darkness of the hideout. Peace was a lie told to the drowning. Acceptance was a luxury for those with nothing left to lose. He still had something to lose. He had her, the ghost of her, and he would burn Amphitrite to the waterline to keep her sacred.
The horror curdled. It cooled. It hardened into something else, something heavy and cold and sharp. Grim determination. If the echo was a weapon, he would be the one to wield it. If it was a key, he would choose the lock. He would not be a passive vessel. He would not be a quiet archive for forgotten ghosts. He would become the storm. He closed his fist. The sharp edges of the coral fragment bit into his palm, a small grounding pain that was all his own. He didn't crush it. Instead, he carefully placed the glowing piece on the damp metal of the crate, its gentle, passive light seeming impossibly small and naive in the vast industrial gloom, a relic of a path not taken, a hope he could no longer afford. He stood up, his body no longer trembling, but held with a rigid stillness. The constant, deep-frequency thrum of the arcology seemed to vibrate in his bones, a familiar rhythm he now heard differently. It wasn't just the sound of a city dying. It was a network, a system, and he was beginning to see the cracks. He turned and walked out of the shadows, his heavy boots echoing on the grated floor. His eyes scanned the main area of the hideout, searching for the hulking silhouette of Grendel Brecker. He had an answer for the Tidal Lord. He had a choice to make, and for the first time it felt like his own. The air in Praxilla Varr's command center was cold and tasted of sterilized, recycled oxygen. It was a clean, sharp contrast to the thick, briny humidity that defined the rest of Amphitrite, a deliberate choice. Here, in her domain, there was no rust, no drip of condensation, no ghostly green-gold fungi clinging to the walls. Only brushed steel consoles, the hum of filtered air, and the cold, sterile blue light of tactical displays. Before her, 3 figures shimmered, their holographic forms wavering slightly with the unstable power draw. The Triarch Council. On the left, Chief Engineer Kalen, his face perpetually shadowed with the fatigue of a man trying to caulk the Grand Canyon with a single tube of sealant. In the center, Director Ryla of Sustenance, her expression pinched, her hands clasped as if praying to a god of uncontaminated water tables. And on the right, her own superior, Arch Compliance Officer Lorne, a man whose spine seemed to be made of aging policy manuals rather than bone. Praxilla stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her posture a column of rigid certainty. She let the silence stretch, forcing them to absorb the weight of the summons. She was the one who had called this meeting. She was the one in control. "Director, Chief Engineer, Officer Lorne," she began, her voice perfectly modulated, betraying no emotion.
Thank you for convening. I will be brief. The situation in the lower districts has evolved beyond a localized structural or biological concern. It is now a citywide security crisis. Kayelan's hologram flickered. Chief Varr, my teams report the sump's integrity is strained, but holding. The quarantine you enacted. The quarantine is a tourniquet on a gangrenous limb, engineer. Praxilla cut him off, her tone sharp as sheared metal. It stops the immediate spread. It does not address the pathogen already in the bloodstream. Director Ryla's latest reports confirm the coral echo contaminant is present in trace amounts past the primary reclamation tanks. That means it's in the pipes. It means it is a matter of time before it is in the Spire. Ryla winced, the statement hitting her like a physical blow. My biochemists are working on enhanced filtration protocols, but the microorganism's resilience is unprecedented. We can't seem to isolate it. You cannot isolate a flood, Praxilla countered. She gestured to a large display behind her. It flickered to life, showing a grainy security feed of Joran, a magnified, depersonalized image. You can only trace it to its source. This is Joran, hull clinger designation 7 Gamma, a deep-sea welder. According to our intel, he was the sole survivor of the recent pressure failure at geothermal tap 3, the one who returned changed. She let the word hang in the cold air. He is no longer a citizen. He is patient 0, a walking, thinking vector for an organism that rewrites the mind. Every breath he takes expels spores. Every place he hides becomes a new infection site. The sump is no longer a district. It is a petri dish, and its people are the culture medium. Lorne, the bureaucrat, finally spoke, his reedy voice laced with anxiety. Chief Varr, Praxilla, that language is inflammatory. These are still citizens of Amphitrite. The hull is the whole. He recited the city's creed, but it sounded hollow, a child's prayer against the dark.
Praxilla's gaze fixed on him, cold and unblinking. For a flicker of a second, she felt a surge of pure contempt. He saw people. She saw variables in an equation of survival. His weakness was a liability the city could not afford. "The whole is compromised, Officer Lorne," she said, her voice dropping to a near-whispering intensity that paradoxically commanded more attention. "The whispers you hear about in the sump, the drownings, these aren't social malaise, they are symptoms. We have cross-referenced the spread of these psychogenic events with Joran's known movements. The correlation is absolute." She brought up another display, a map of the sump, latticed with glowing red lines that pulsed ominously. "This is a predictive model. Based on the current rate of contagion and the sump's population density, we project a 70% cognitive collapse in the district within 3 cycles. From there, it will breach the quarantine, not with force, but through the ventilation, through the water, through the very pipes Kalen is struggling to maintain. It will climb the spire, and it will turn this arcology into a silent, screaming tomb." Kalen looked pale. "Rust rot, what are you proposing? A full sterilization? We can't. The infrastructure wouldn't survive the chemical agents." "No, a chemical solution is too crude. It damages the host, the city." Praxilla corrected herself. "We must be surgical. We must excise the disease, not kill the patient." She took a breath, her moment of calculated theater arriving. The founders anticipated such a threat.
a biological agent that could undermine the city from within, turning its citizens against its own survival. They created a fail-safe, a contingency protocol that gives compliance the authority to act decisively, unburdened by debate. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I am formally invoking the Hull Integrity Act, Section 4, Paragraph 2. I am requesting emergency authority from this council to implement mandatory citywide health screenings, total access to all residential and commercial zones, the authority to detain and isolate any individual showing symptomatic markers of coral echo infection regardless of their station. Lorne's holographic image went rigid. Praxilla, that is martial law. You are talking about suspending the foundational liberties of this arcology.
Liberty is a luxury for a healthy body, Praxilla shot back, her voice finally rising, resonating with the unshakable force of her conviction. It is a fatal indulgence for a diseased one. We are not a society of individuals anymore. We are a single organism trapped in a metal shell, surrounded by an ocean that wants to crush us. Our shared survival is the only right that matters now. The hull is the whole. She used their own ideology against them, twisting it into a weapon. She watched their faces. Kalen, the pragmatist, was already defeated, his mind calculating the structural cost of inaction versus the social cost of her plan. Ryla, the scientist, saw the grim logic. It was Lorne, the man of rules, who was the last bastion of a world that no longer existed. He looked from Kalen to Ryla, searching for an ally, and found only resigned fear. His shoulders slumped. The act requires a unanimous vote from the council, he stated, his voice barely audible. Praxilla remained silent, her expression an impassive mask. She had already won. She knew it. The fear she had cultivated for years, the culture of pressure paranoia, had ripened perfectly. They were afraid of the abyss, of the groaning hull, but most of all, they were afraid of the chaos she had so vividly painted for them. Director Ryla? Lorne asked. Aye, Ryla whispered, her eyes closed. Chief Engineer Kalen? Kalen stared at the pulsing red map. Aye. All eyes turned to Lorne. He looked at Praxilla, at the unyielding certainty in her gaze. He was looking at the new, true authority in Amphitrite. His own was an illusion. The motion passes. The authority is yours, Chief Varr. May the abyss have mercy on us all. The holograms flickered and died, one by one, leaving Praxilla alone in the silence of her command center. The constant deep-frequency thrum of the city's turbines seemed to quiet, as if holding its breath. She stood motionless for a full 10 seconds. Then slowly, a small, cold smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of joy, but of vindication, triumph. They were weak, sentimental fools clinging to ideals forged on a world with a sun and open air. They did not understand the nature of this place, this battle, but she did. She turned to the main tactical map of Amphitrite, a colossal blue schematic dominating the far wall. Her eyes traced the lines from the sump to the Spire atrium. She no longer saw districts or people or homes. She saw a body on an operating table riddled with disease. And she, Praxilla Varr, was the surgeon, scalpel in hand, ready to cut away the rot, no matter how much of the patient she had to remove to save its life. The path to Grendel Brecker's domain was a descent through the arcology's forgotten arteries. Jorin moved through a maze of decommissioned service tunnels, a world away from the sump's grimly organized squalor. Here, the only light came from rogue strands of bioluminescent fungi, casting a ghostly green-gold sheen on walls, slick with black condensation. The air tasted of rust and decay, thick with the sharp, clean scent of ozone leaking from frayed power conduits that snaked overhead like metallic vines. The constant, deep-frequency thrum of the city was different here, muffled, distant, replaced by the intimate sounds of the sump's guts, the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water finding its way to the absolute bottom, and the low, grinding moan of a nearby reclamation pump working against the abyss. He felt the whispers of the choral echo recede, not into silence, but into a low, expectant hum. It was as if they knew where he was going, as if they were curious. He found the pumping station exactly where the Sump Rat Whisper Network said it would be. It wasn't a room so much as a cavern carved out of the foundation's concrete and steel. A massive jury-rigged impeller pump dominated the space, its salvaged housing shuddering with a heavy rhythmic thump, chunk, thump, chunk. Pipes, thick as a man's torso and weeping rust-colored tears, converged on the machine from all directions. The air was hot and thick, smelling of superheated lubricant and the faint peppery scent of glimmer moss. A single sodium vapor work lamp cast everything in a sickly orange glare, making shadows stretch and twist like living things. And in the center of it all, sitting on a reinforced crate like a king on a corroded throne, was Grendel Brecker.
He wasn't looking at the entrance. He was polishing a piece of old-world tech, a silvery data drive with a surprisingly delicate touch. He was a broad man, his frame thickened by a life of heavy work and black market authority. His face was a roadmap of sump life, scarred, weathered, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He didn't look up as Jorin stepped out of the shadows, the wet slap of his boots echoing in the cavernous space. He just kept polishing. "Took you long enough, Jorin," Grendel said, his voice a low gravel that easily cut through the pump's mechanical heartbeat. "Was beginning to think you'd decided to turn yourself in, take Praxilla's mercy. Heard she's real generous with it." Jorin stopped a dozen feet away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His own desperation felt like a tangible thing, a cold weight in his stomach. The cacophony in his head, the memories of drownings and panicked last breaths, was quiet for now, but the silence was fragile. He was a fugitive, a symptom, a monster in waiting. He had no other moves left on the board. "I'm here to take your offer," Jorin said, his voice flat and raw. "Sanctuary, a place to think." Grendel finally looked up. He set the data drive down with deliberate care and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. The orange light carved deep shadows into the lines on his face. He didn't smile. Not yet. "Sanctuary is a valuable commodity, especially for a man with the Compliance Division's brand on his back. They're sweeping the gills, you know, turning over every bunk. The bounty on Patient Zero is high enough to make a Spire-born blush." He paused, letting the words hang in the hot, oily air. "So, you're not just looking for a place to think. You're looking for a place to hide. And my hospitality, it isn't free." Jorin's jaw tightened. "I know. You want my insight, the things I've been seeing, feeling." It was the first time he'd said it aloud to anyone but himself. The words felt alien, like a confession of madness. Grendel's eyes lit with a flicker of avaricious interest. "Insight," he repeated, tasting the word. "That's a delicate way to put it. I hear you put your hand on a ruptured water main and knew exactly where the microfracture was, saved half a hab block from a pressure flood. That's more than insight, Welder. That's a gift."
"It's not a gift," Joran shot back, a tremor of revulsion in his voice. "It's a contamination. It's voices. It's other people." He took a deep breath, fighting to keep his composure, fighting the memory of a little girl with blonde hair who wasn't his daughter, drowning in a flooding compartment he'd never seen before. "Whatever it is, it's useful," Grendel said, his tone shifting from probing to practical. "Amphitrite is dying, Joran. The hull is a hole. Rust rot. The hull is a sieve, held together with prayer and cheap sealant. The Spire-born know it, Praxilla knows it, they're just better at lying about it. But a man who can feel the city's bones, who knows where it's gonna break before it does, that's not a weapon, that's a key. The key to everything." Joran took a step forward, his boots crunching on grit. The thrum of the pump seemed to vibrate up through the soles of his feet, a constant reminder of the machine that was Amphitrite. "I'll help you," he said, the words costing him more than Grendel could ever know. "I'll find your weak spots, the salvage points, the structural flaws you can exploit." He paused, meeting the Tidal Lord's gaze. He had to draw a line. He had to keep one small piece of his soul from being washed away by the tide in his head. "But I have one condition." Grendel raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Oh?" "I'll point the way," Joran said, his voice hard as pressure-forged steel. "But I won't help you kill anyone. No wet work, no accidents. My knowledge is for salvage, for finding leverage, not for spilling blood. I won't have more ghosts on my conscience." He stood his ground, his entire being coiled around that single principle. It was the last piece of the old Joran he had left to defend. The pump cycled. Thump, chonk. A drip of water hit a metal plate somewhere in the darkness. Ting. Grendel's face broke into a wide, slow smile. It was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. It didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold, calculating pits of orange-lit shadow. He leaned back, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Deep and safe, Joran. I have your word. This is a business arrangement. We're Tide Lords, not butchers. We deal in jewel chits and influence, not body counts. Your hands stay clean."
He stood and picked up a canister from the crate next to him. He unsealed it and poured a clear liquid into 2 metal cups. The smell of natural, unrecycled minerals, an impossible luxury in the sump, filling the air. "To our new partnership," Grendel said, holding one of the cups out to Joran. Joran stared at the cup. He knew with a certainty that went deeper than the echo that Grendel's promise was worthless. He knew that the moment it became convenient, the Tide Lord would drown 1,000 souls to get what he wanted. A desperate man's principles are flexible, and Grendel was a master at applying pressure. But the compliance patrols were out there. Praxilla Varr was hunting him, and the chorus of the dead in his head was waiting for him to be alone again. With a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, Joran took the cup. The cold metal was a stark, solid reality. He had made his deal. He had shaken the devil's hand.
He didn't drink, he just held it, the grim determination in his chest slowly souring into the cold, heavy dread of an alliance he already knew he would regret. Grendel's hand was a collection of scars and calluses, a history of busted knuckles and desperate repairs written in flesh. It closed around Joran's, the grip firm, pragmatic, devoid of warmth. It was a deal struck not in trust, but in shared desperation, a pact sealed with the city's low, constant groan as its witness. Deep and safe, Grendel said, the traditional greeting twisting into a cynical confirmation. He released his grip and turned back to a console cobbled together from scavenged parts. Sparks spat from an exposed power conduit near his elbow, illuminating the Tide Lord's face in a brief electric blue flash. You get me what I need, Joran. Pinpoint the rot in the Spire's plumbing, the structural flaws they patch with prayers and pretty lives. In return, you get to stay a ghost. My ghost.
Joran gave a slow, stiff nod. The air in the hideout, a precarious nest woven into the skeletal ironwork above a major sump thoroughfare, was thick with the smell of ozone and hot metal. Wires, thick as pythons, snaked across the floor and ceiling, dripping condensation that hissed on overheated processors. It was a place that felt alive, a parasitic organism feeding on Ampertrite's failing electrical grid. For the first time in days, the cacophony in Joran's head had receded to a low murmur, the chorus of the drowned momentarily hushed by the sheer, pressing reality of his new alliance. He was a tool, a weapon, but he was hidden. For now. He watched Grendel's back, the man's focus already consumed by a flickering schematic. A strange sense of calm, cold and heavy as the abyss itself, settled in Joran's chest. He had a purpose again, however sordid. It was a foundation, something to stand on while his own mind dissolved like salt in water. He could work with this. He could. The sound hit like a physical blow, not the familiar shriek of metal under stress or the boom of a distant pressure shift. This was new. A piercing, cyclical klaxon that sliced through the city's deep thrum, high-pitched and relentless. It was a sound designed to shred nerves, to signal an emergency so total that it bypassed all standard alerts. Every pipe, every bulkhead, every drop of recycled water in the sump seemed to vibrate with it. Grendel froze, his hand hovering over the console. "Rest rot," he spat, the curse nearly swallowed by the rising alarm. "What now?" Before Joran could answer, the sump lit up. Holographic projectors, usually reserved for ration bulletins and shift change timers, sputtered to life on every major wall. They flickered, stabilized, and cast a cold, sterile light onto the terrified faces beginning to emerge from their container habs below. On every screen, the same image resolved, the severe, unyielding face of Praxilla Varr, Chief Compliance Officer. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her cheekbones. Her eyes were chips of obsidian. Her voice, amplified and eerily calm against the shrieking klaxons, filled every corner of the district. By order of the Triarch Council, under the authority granted by the Hull Integrity Act, the Public Health Integrity Protocol is now in effect, citywide.
Joran felt the blood drain from his face. He stumbled toward the rusty grill that served as Grendel's window, his knuckles white as he gripped the corroded metal. Below, the thoroughfare was descending into chaos. People were pouring out of their homes, drawn by the alarms, their faces upturned and slack with confusion and fear. A foreign biological agent has been detected within our shared life support systems, Praxilla's voice continued, a scalpel of sound dissecting the panic. This contaminant poses an existential threat to the whole, to the hull. An infection of the individual is an infection of us all. There is no room for sentiment. There is no tolerance for sickness. Joran's breath hitched. Sickness. That's what they called it. What he was, what Hestian was. Not a change, not a symbiosis, but a plague to be excised. And then he saw them, emerging from service tunnels at both ends of the thoroughfare, moving with the disciplined, inhuman precision he'd only ever seen in archival footage of pre-inundation riot police. Squads of compliance officers in stark white pressure gear, their helmets obscuring any trace of humanity. They carried pulse rifles, but in their other hands they held smaller, more insidious devices, bioscanners. No. The teams fanned out, forming a cordon. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. They began to herd the panicked citizens, funneling them toward the center of the walkway. Giant mobile floodlights were erected, bathing the scene in a harsh clinical glare that bleached the familiar orange worklights and green fungi into sickly shades of gray. Mandatory screening is now underway, Praxilla's voice declared, as if announcing a routine maintenance cycle. Your full and immediate cooperation is not a request, it is a civic duty. Obstructing a compliance officer is an act of sedition against the hall itself. Remain calm. Present yourselves for testing. The healthy have nothing to fear. Joran watched, mesmerized by the horror. A woman was grabbed, a mother trying to shield her child. An officer pressed a scanner to her neck. The device whirred softly. A green light glowed on its side. The officer gave a curt shove, pushing her back into the growing, terrified herd. Then they grabbed a man in a welder's jacket, his face pale with dread. The scanner was pressed to his skin. It whirred. It flashed red. Instantly, two other officers seized the man. He screamed, a raw, desperate sound that was cut short as one of them slammed a tranquilizer patch onto his neck. His body went limp. They dragged him away, his boots scraping on the metal deck, toward a waiting transport vehicle Joran hadn't noticed before. A sterile white container, windowless and grim. A portable tomb. The hunt wasn't just for him anymore. It was for anyone like him. The city had turned on itself, armed with Praxilla's cold logic and a device that could sign a death warrant with a single flash of red light. Beside him, Grendel let out a low, humorless laugh. "Well," he said, his voice laced with a bitter sort of admiration. "She doesn't waste time, does she, Spire-born butcher?" He turned from the window, his expression hardening back into pragmatic resolve. "This complicates things, makes them more expensive, but the plan's the same. They're looking for a disease. We'll just have to be a cancer. Harder to find, harder to kill." But Joran barely heard him. He was still staring down at the scene below, the white uniforms, the red light, the systematic, dispassionate processing of human lives. The whispers in his head were silent, utterly silenced by the roaring fear in his own heart. The uneasy alliance he had just forged felt like a handful of sand. The hideout no longer felt safe. No place was. Praxilla Varr had just put a cage around the entire city, and now she was rattling the bars, looking for anyone who didn't belong. The city wasn't just groaning anymore.